From the Florida Atheist Studio in Tampa, this is the Atheist Forum News and Commentary with your host Joe Reinhardt and Galen Matson. Join us now for the atheist perspective on today's events as we discuss today's topic, torture, politics, and religion. And now, here's Joe Reinhardt.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, audience. Torture, politics, and religion. Who's in favor of these and why? This has been a very heavily talked about subject over the last week or two because of the CIA report and the Pew report. And so now it's the Atheists of Florida report is going to talk about it this afternoon or evening. My name is Joe Reinhardt. My co-host and friend, Galen Matson, will be handling the hosting duties, and we will be accepting questions from our audience anytime. Don't wait 10 minutes or 2 minutes. If you have a question, just feel free to put up your hand, and we'll be happy to recognize you as soon as possible. You know, a lot of folks have heard the rather tired old cliche that, excuse me, that politics is the last refuge of scoundrels. That may well be true, but frankly, religion is the first refuge of scoundrels, and when you combine the two, you have a very, very unhappy situation. That's why we're all in favor of separation of church and state. That's what we're all about. Of late, the Pew report has issued some interesting statistics about the CIA torture report. Over half the people in this country are okay with torturing someone in their name. I personally am not. I know it takes a lot of courage to stand up for truth and justice and the American way, but I'm here to do it today as long as it doesn't involve torture.
The real thing that was interesting there was if you dig into how those statistics pan out, it's not just, you know, half of Americans, it's a particular subset of Americans that support torture. Not even just to get vital information to save lives, but even to advance American interests in other ways. And that naturally turns out to be religious fundamentalists have very high support for the use of torture to get information, and it even extends beyond, you know, using it against Islamist terrorists in the case of Guantanamo and so forth. So you have to look for, you know, what are the reasons for that? And there are, I think, inherent psychological reasons that are, you know, ingrained from having a religious worldview. Is you see ample instances of torture in the Bible, and you have the epic instance of torture, which is hell. So God prescribes infinite punishment for finite crimes done in your lifetime. So really, anything that we could do somebody on a waterboard or some other creative means of putting the screws to them really sort of pales in comparison to the punishments meted out in the
It's
Bible.
just a tiny little sample of what the Almighty in His infinite mercy has in mind for transgressors for all eternity. And you know what makes this even more reprehensible is that the crime in question isn't even an act or a deed, it's a thought. You can be forgiven for any crime except for blaspheming the Holy Ghost, making fun of the sacred spook, if you will. Anything else can be forgiven. Cut up your mother with a chainsaw, you can still go to heaven, no problem. And so what we basically have is the sort of stuff that, that dictators and tyrants of every calling and every stripe lie awake at night dreaming that they could have the ability to punish people for what they think.
The only unforgivable crime is infidelity to the regime.
Exactly.
very
The
totalitarian inherently.
only crime that you cannot be forgiven for, according to the Holy Bible, is blasphemy of the Holy Ghost. Anything else, there's some argument about once saved, always saved, whether you can simply be saved by grace, the fact that acts alone cannot get you into heaven. And belief alone cannot get you into heaven. The devil believes.
Jesus was very clear about
God
this.
and
There's
he's not in
no way
heaven.
to heaven except through me. There's no way into the kingdom except through the Son.
But some combination of belief is essential, whether it's works and belief, or works or belief, or just belief. At some point, you have to believe in the resurrection and the supremacy of Jesus in order to be a Christian and in order to attain immortal life. So it's a matter of belief. It's a matter of opinion. It's a difference of opinion. I always like to promise people, if there's anyone in our audience who doesn't think that it's reprehensible to punish someone for what they think, just let me know. I have a baseball bat out in my trunk, and I think we can settle this issue rather quickly. Just a little experiment involving your kneecaps.
So, we're always given the Reader's Digest version of the Bible. I'm personally a fan of the Bible. I think it's a great read. It's one of my favorite books of fiction. And in it, you actually, you'll read about exquisite tortures that were done, maybe not like particularly under God's exact direction, but he was certainly happy with the outcome. David, after defeating the Ammonites, he puts them through kilns, and he tortures the survivors, and God was certainly very happy about that. So if you really want to justify your belief that torture is an acceptable way to treat other human beings, you don't actually have to read that far into the Bible to get examples of where it's not just practiced, but it's lauded by the Supreme Being himself. And that's before you even get to the ultimate torture of hell.
Hell itself. I have an article here by Valerie Tarico. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's 10 times when the Bible says that it's okay to torture someone. I think this is relevant, and it answers the question of why so many religious people, not just fundamentalists, but religious people of all stripes, are not appalled by the waterboarding, the other atrocities far worse than that were committed in our name over the last 10 years or more. And why the majority of the people in the United States, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, wouldn't come out in the streets with pitchforks and torches, it just surprises me. But if you read this article, you can see that there are 10 pretty good reasons, biblically, why it's okay to torture people. So I'll run down this list. We'll take a minute or two, a sentence or two to discuss each one, shall we? Put this over here out of the way. The first one, torture as punishment. She lists Eve's curse. You know, when Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, Eve was sentenced to experience pain in childbirth and to bruise her heel on the head of the serpent. But at any rate, she was, that's why women suffer in childbirth, because they ate a magic fruit. People do take this seriously. One of the first women ever to use an anesthetic in order to ease the pain of childbirth was burned alive right on the grounds of Edinburgh Castle in Scotland back in the 19th century, I believe it was the 19th century. She and her doctor were both burned alive for having tried to foil the hand of Providence by avoiding the pain of childbirth. So punishment as torture is a pretty good example in the Bible. And she goes on to cite some other examples here, if you want to talk about that for a second.
Oh, this is one of my favorites. The story of Job. Torture as a test of loyalty. In the book of Job, torture isn't a punishment, but rather a test of loyalty. Job, a righteous man, becomes the subject of a divine wager between God and Satan, who claims that Job is faithful only because he is blessed with health and wealth. Bets are laid, and over time Job is subject to the first psychological and then physical anguish. His crops fail, his house collapses, crushing all of his children during a family gathering. He is rejected by neighbors and ends up a beggar covered in painful boils. After Job passes the test, God restores his health and his wealth and replaces his dead children. Christians to this day frequently perceive inexplicable and unmerited suffering as a test of faith.
He replaces, excuse me, throat problem. He replaces his Job's dead children with new children, not with the original children. They stay dead.
That should give you some insight into, how God values human beings. First of all, he murdered innocent children over a bet. And it also sort of calls into question the Christian view on Satan, because in here, God and Satan are just kind of like hanging out talking, and Satan's like, hey, I think I could turn your most loyal follower, and God's like, go ahead. And so he lets him kill Job's entire family. Innocent people had nothing to do with this, just to prove a point.
Well, it's really a rather flimsy attempt to try to answer the question of why do bad things happen to good people when a staunch believer and a regular tither suddenly gets terminal cancer or gets run down by a truck or whatever. They always use the example of the patience of Job in order to survive through hard times. So it's an attempt to answer what in apologetics is called the argument from evil. Right? And I'm sure most of you people are familiar with the argument from evil. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing and all-merciful, why do we have evil? If he knows about it and doesn't do anything about it, right, then he certainly is not all-merciful. If he knows about it and can't do anything about it, he's certainly not all-powerful. And if he knows about it and he doesn't do about anything anyway, or can't do anything about it, then he's certainly not a deity. So I think we have...
Then why call him God?
I think we have Epicurus to thank for that. That's how old that argument is.
Right.
So much for the argument from evil, and so much for the argument of poor old Job sitting out on his dunghill, which is where he belonged. Okay. Torture for self-gratification and gain. One of my favorites. The Midianite virgins. The Hebrews swept in and killed all of overran the Midianites, and then the high priest, Elishu or something of that name, and Moses both became upset because they had not killed all of the boys and they had not killed all the women who had known a man. If
we're talking about the same thing, they wiped out the Midianites and they did kill all the boys, and their instructions were to kill everything, man, woman, donkey.
That's the Amalekites.
The Amalekites. I'm sorry.
The Midianites, they killed all of the women that had ever known a man.
Get them all mixed up with so many
all of the males,
genocides.
And they took all of the girls who had never known a man, and those they gave those to the troops. 10% of them they gave to the priests. Now, how they went about gynecologically determining which ones to kill, you can sort of imagine that for yourself. While you're at it, you might picture what it's like to be thrown into the hands of the people that have just murdered everyone you know. Not a very happy situation. So there we have self-gratification and gain. I mean, frankly, one of the reasons that war just isn't appealing to me anymore is we don't have rape and torture like we used to. You know, you don't have to.
Really kind of.
You don't have to pay me. I'm willing to work on commission, but no.
You spoiled the war.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, in the case of the Amalekites, they were instructed to kill man, woman, child, all that, even the animals, and leave nothing at all alive. And the soldiers, they didn't. They wiped out all the males, as is customary, I suppose. But they brought the women back to the camp of the Israelites. and they took them to Moses and said, "Hey, isn't this, great? We got a bunch of girls." And Moses was angry because they hadn't killed every single person, but his instructions were to slay every woman that has known a man. So that means that every virgin daughter had to see her mother murdered in front of her, and then be given as a prize to a Israelite soldier, which that's pretty exquisite torture, as far as I can.
Well, again, it's a good example of torture for self-gratification and gain, and it relates to the more topical subject of why are we so apathetic, so indifferent about torture by our own government? Since the vast majority of people in this country claim to be believers of some depth or description, I think they at least subscribe on the surface to these biblical stories. If you don't like these stories, by the way, it's not our fault. We didn't write them, okay? We're just pointing them out.
Don't blame us for reading the Bible.
Torture as a show of strength. One of my favorites, the Egyptians. The Pharaoh was ready to let Moses and his people go 4 or 5 plagues ago, but every
God
time
hardened his heart.
God hardened his heart, which is, I think, interfering with his free will, which we know God never does because it says so right here in the Bible. But finally we got to the 10th plague, and he killed even the firstborn of the maid in the mill, or the prisoner in his cell. Wasn't just Egyptians, and it wasn't just royalty. And the only reason that he didn't let the Egyptians go, again, 4 or 5 plagues ago, was so that he could show what a bad ass he was. He could show that he was bigger and tougher and meaner than all of the other gods that were competing in the deity arena at that moment. He did it just to show you he was a terrorist.
And there was actually nothing the Egyptians could have done. It was, first of all, it was the Pharaoh, not the Egyptians, right? Why didn't he punish the Pharaoh? So he punished everyone, and he also hardened the Pharaoh's heart so that he couldn't have acted otherwise. That meant that God predestined that the firstborn of Egypt would all die as a punishment that they couldn't have avoided. So that was torture that he was intent on, and there was no way out. You have a question?
Isn't this all Old Testament, and didn't Jesus do away with the Old Testament?
The question
No.
was, isn't this all Old Testament, and didn't Jesus do away with the Old Testament?
He didn't. He said he did not come to overturn the law. He came to fulfill it. And so he perhaps he supplements it, and he adds some of the better parts of Christianity that people like to filter it down to, but he didn't overturn the Old Testament.
He said that he had come to fulfill the laws, not to overturn them, and that apart from the law having to do with divorce, that the laws of the Old Testament wouldn't be changed by one jot or one tittle. He tells the young man who asked him, I think, at the Sermon on the Mount, what do I have to do to be saved, and like you, teacher? And he says, you have to obey the commandments. Sell everything that thou hast, and honor your father and your mother, and follow me.
And the major, probably the biggest thing regarding this that we get out of the New Testament is the concept of hell. The Jews in the Torah, they didn't have an eternal punishment. In fact, it wasn't really very verbose on the afterlife at all, but it wasn't until Gentle Jesus that we get this idea of eternal torture after death, for often very petty things that you did on earth, or
Even thoughts, worse yet.
thoughts.
Yeah.
For thought crime.
The thought was the deed. You have a lustful thought, you're on your way to hell. You don't have to rape anybody, you just have to think about it.
Or not be a convert of Jesus through no fault of your own, because the one person that could save you from hell happened to be born in an obscure part of the world, not to a culture that even had writing, like the Chinese or somebody else.
100
You had because of a trick of geography and lineage.
100% of the events that are portrayed in the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran occur within about a 200-mile radius in the Mideast. That was their area of expertise, and as far as they were concerned, that was the entire known world, the existing universe. Now, I had another question. Michael?
I was just going to say, as a former Christian, deconverted Christian for a long time, and certainly a student of the Bible for a long time in detail, there's another thing that sometimes is frequently overlooked when you're having this discussion about whether the Old Testament replaced the New Testament, the New Testament replaced the Old Testament. That was then, this is now. There's a couple of things that are taught in apologetics that really are taught by those that follow the Christian faith religiously and continuously. And those are the principles that God is the same today, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And he knows the beginning before the end, that he does not change. I am unchangeable. And this is said so many times and in so many different ways. And then when you're talking to someone, you say, well, that was then, that's the way God had to deal with people then, but he's like this now.
Yeah, right.
And it's so easy to point out over and over and over again how God supposedly changed his mind. His mind was changed. I mean, the whole story of the ark and the flood. I mean, God repented that he made man. What the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
It means he said, oh, that was a screw up. You know, I shouldn't have done that. So let me get rid of all these people, you know, and all these babies and everything else. But I do want to make an issue about a question about the torture thing. And I get all this, and I've been through all of that, certainly many times. The issue with you're equating the torture of a prisoner of war, if we want to call it a prisoner of war, in the attempt to get information to thwart future potential destruction and death. Okay, so the motivation behind the torture. Now you're talking about motivation of revenge, all these motivations you can show in biblical literature, and that's totally 100% correct. But to be fair, in the understanding of what's
Right,
going
the
on
rationale
here,
given.
you have to take the political structure in somehow into account. Okay.
Right, I saw
I'm not trying to
Cheney's
justify
argument on it.
torture,
Everybody,
but if this is a philosophical question, someone took my children, okay, took my children, and I knew this was a fact, and they buried him in a hole in the ground somewhere out. This is a movie, isn't it? Okay, and the only way I could get that information was they put me in a room with this person. He said, I'm not telling you where they are, and they're going to be dead in 2 hours from, you know. If
right.
this
Well,
is-
I tell you what, if that situation ever occurs, call me, because of the, let's say we tortured 1,000 people. If one of those was even in the same county with that argument.
I totally agree it's never going to happen, but I don't think that you can fully 100% equate what you're talking
There
about.
are perfectly good reasons to shoot somebody in the head, okay?
I agree.
I think that's absolutely a fair distinction. But if you look at the polls that were done on religious views of torture, people have a punitive view that if somebody is an enemy of ours, and often they hold these same views about prisoners. So it's not specifically people at Guantanamo. You tend to just have a view that people that are, you consider bad or, are enemies for one reason or another do not deserve the same rights and charity as the average person does. And that, of course, extends to prisoners of war. I don't think there's many people that would argue that if you knew for a fact that you could torture somebody that would save 100 lives hours later, then that would be the rational thing to do and the compassionate thing in scope.
You
But-
see these kinds of questions ethically all the time. Should you push a guy off of a cliff if it would change a train track so
Yeah,
that the
that's
train
a-
won't kill 5 people?
Philosophical question.
Right.
is
What do you
always
do?
asked in class.
Yeah. So,
Well, it's, it's also a,
luckily we
matter
don't
of-
find ourselves in those kinds of
But I do
situations
think
very
the
often.
motivation is an issue, okay? Whether you think the action is right or wrong, there are, in our country, in our culture, in our moral, my own humanistic belief of things, there are mitigating circumstances. People say, well, murder is wrong. Really? Always? In every situation?
Of course not.
Killing another human being is always wrong. I can give you 100 different things that could happen, and I'd kill somebody dead right now.
Sure.
Just like that. So are you really, we need to take that into consideration. I agree with you 100% that it is the religious right of our country that takes these positions 80-90% of the time.
I
Right,
think
that is our
that's
argument,
certainly,
that
that's,
I think it's a good argument.
It makes the problem worse for our country because of our religious beliefs, our hand in glove with torture is a biblical constant.
Yes, it is.
We haven't even scratched the surface.
well, things like killing and torture, they're not always wrong, but they're very rarely right. So if you look at the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he was the second in command of Al-Qaeda, and we waterboarded him 157 times,
I don't know.
something to that effect, and got no valuable intel out of it. Nothing that was actionable. At some point, you just start telling people
Torture usually
whatever
has
they
the
want to hear.
reverse effect.
People will just lie to you, tell
and
you
the people-
whatever they
The people
can.
who do that, who torture, know that. It's not like this is a secret. Okay?
So
people
here's-
know that you usually get, or they'll tell you whatever you want. Who do you want me to incriminate? One of the reasons that torture during the Dark Ages seemed to be so popular and so enthusiastically pursued is because the torturers enjoyed it. I don't think people have changed in that respect.
My concern is that if we do apply these sort of strategies in advancing our geopolitical goals, it corrupts the United States morally, and it will be ruinous on our national character to allow this to continue.
That's right, it hurts me. I don't know whether it hurts the subject of the torture, but it damages me, and for that reason, I'm against it. I'm against all torture, believe me.
Jim?
Yes, I think it could be helpful to try to get some of the background on all this. The Heshemites and the Melianites and the Selenites and whoever would just as easily do the same thing to the Israelites as the Israelites were doing to them, because this was the typical and characteristic behavior of Bronze Age people.
True.
And we have in our own time a carryover of those same Bronze Age people, the same outlook and mentality. It basically reflects profound ignorance about the knowledge that we have accumulated over the past 150 years or so. Our understanding of psychology, of archaeology, of anthropology, of ourselves and the world in which we live enables us to create a regime where human kindness is a premium moral issue, and rather than revenge.
One minute.
And,
We have about 1 minute left.
okay, well, I'll be quick,
Good.
very quick. But at any rate, I think it is imperative that we apply contemporary standards to our lives if we want to avoid, and communicate it to everyone, if we want to avoid these kinds of torturous outcomes.
Wow. Well said. I think the Bible is a time capsule of Bronze Age morality that we continuously import into a far better and progressive society, and we should let it go.
All right, I think next week we'll talk about the Quran and violence and blasphemy. But until then, remember, if the story seems too implausible to be true, don't believe it just because somebody wrote it down.
Make them prove it.
Prove it.